started, I think you all know who I am, but I always like to start with introductions. I'm Pastor Sarah, one of the pastors here at Grace,
And I'm officially Reverend Dr. Dawn Alitz from Luther Seminary, but I hang out in your pews a lot.
love that, yeah. And we thought that a really practical and needed thing that we could incorporate into Lent, which our Lenten theme starts with the phrase, being mortal, right? That if we could offer a space where we could talk a little bit more openly, candidly, creatively about the task of planning one's own funeral, that might be really helpful to those in our community who feel at all curious or inclined toward doing that. As a way of starting, I'm just curious, how many of you have already planned your funeral? Started to. Nice. How many of you have thought about planning your own funeral? How many of you dread the thought of planning your funeral? Yes, this is for absolute honesty. How many of you have experienced a death in your family where there were no funeral plans for the person who had died? And how did that go? How many of you would say that went just fine? You figured it out. And how many of you would say it was like a source of tension or anxiety or? Okay, yeah. And how many of you have experienced a loved one dying and having a funeral already planned for that person? Okay. All of that is normal, and all of that is okay. Today is really an invitation for you to consider. Today, in 2 months, sometimes I hear things, I'm like, yes, and then it takes me a while to get to the point of actually penning something on paper. As I said in worship, the invitation to plan your funeral is an ever-present invitation. So what you might feel moved to put on paper this week might change in a couple years. That can be because relationships change. That can be because your idea of God and what you want proclaimed about God might change. That can be that something you liked 5 years ago you don't really like anymore. Like, we change. So feel free to let this be an evolving thing. But we are going to strongly encourage and urge you to move in the direction of thinking about this and giving this some time for a variety of reasons. The way we thought we would do this, just so we don't just jump right into logistics, I'm just assuming that all of you come into this space with a story about a funeral. A funeral you were part of, a funeral you attended and hated, a funeral you felt was really meaningful, a funeral that you barely got through because it was so hard, maybe a death that happened that had no funeral. So I just recognize that there are probably so many stories in this room. I just want to be really sensitive to this is not an easy topic. None of us are going to approach it in the same way. But we thought as a way to just get us in the room and kind of humanize the topic, that Dawn was willing to share. Dawn has journeyed this. Your mom died a year ago. Sorry, does this work? Okay. I know that my voice doesn't always carry, so I'll go ahead and use this. My mom died a year ago December. Okay. Yeah. And Dawn has, throughout this process, shared some things with me about that experience, and so I just invited her to be in this space. Neither of us are experts. We're sojourners with you, and we are in families, too, that are trying to figure this out, sometimes more smoothly than others. So we're all in this together, but I invited Dawn just to share with us if there's an experience of moving into this near-death time with a parent, how that went with your family. And then you shared some things about your parents and their funeral planning. So wherever you want to take that.
All right. Well, first of all, just one thing that you just said that I want to make sure that I lift up, and that is pastors do not have any special insight or special pass or smoother journey on this route than anyone else. And so just to know that this is really one of those areas where we are all very mortal. Very mortal. And every person, every family is different. So my mother had a very long disease, and her journey toward death started probably 7 years ago, with Lewy body dementia. And so there were several times that we didn't know if the end was imminent or far away. It was one of these moving targets. She would get very sick and she would recover. But we started early on, when she was still had a freedom of mind, good thoughts. She and I sat down one afternoon and I said, "Mom, what do you want?" And she said, "I don't want to talk about this." And I said, "No, it's hard for me too. I want to know, I want to hear your story from you, because my story of you as a daughter, the details and the clarity ended at some point. Like, I got really involved with my own family, I got involved with a lot of other families, and I know your life has gone on in very deep ways, and I don't always know what the most important thing, or the thing you're most proud of, or the thing you love the most. I don't know what those are. I don't know your favorite song." And so, what I will say is that it led to a really beautiful conversation once we got into it. Leave yourself lots of time and lots of grace. And it did get me thinking about what I wanted. I didn't get it written down yet, but I did want to, it's got me thinking about it. And even the afternoon of my mom's funeral, my dad and I sat down, and my dad started telling me what he wanted. And it was a hard day. I wasn't sure I was quite ready to hear his story yet, but he was ready to give it. So when people are ready to give it, you're ready to receive it, whenever that comes out. I think the other piece that Pastor Sarah was talking about is my beloved mother, when she was a young woman and working, actually was the secretary at a funeral home, which meant she heard lots of stories, and it meant that she and my father bought all of their funeral stuff 50 years ago. I know.
So how old were they?
They were 30, 33, very young. And we had to pay nothing for their funeral, and everything was written out. Now, some of it didn't work anymore, right? There were things that were in funerals back then that no longer existed the same way. And there's some pieces that couldn't. So just the more, if you have ways that you wish your remains to be planted, if you have a place where you want them to be, that's actually an argument in my current family, because my husband's family is all buried in a little church cemetery in the rural Wisconsin. And I'm kind of a green person. I want to just be planted by a tree, but my daughters want me to be with the rest of the family. She says, "Mom, how will I know where to visit you?" So these are the questions that come up. And I'm going to scoot to the end, and then we can open this up. And that is, when my mother did pass away last year, the three of us kids, first of all, my father is now 92 and doesn't have a great memory. And I looked around at my brothers, and I'm like, oh my gosh, we're the old family that I usually sit around with at the church. Like, we're all 60s and 70s, sitting around. And just to share, my brother is a non-denominational covenant church person, and my other brother is Catholic, and I'm a female Lutheran pastor. If we would have had to untangle the theological things for that funeral all by ourselves, it would have been really hard. And so you might not think that it matters for you to think about what you once said about God, that some pastor will take care of it. Please do us pastors a little bit of a service and think about what you want said or sung or proclaimed about God in your final moments. Is that good?
Yeah,
All right.
great. Before we dive into this packet, are there questions you're coming with today that you hope we can talk about?
So some of us here have already taken care of our funeral arrangements. And at the time that we did ours, we gave a copy, we were instructed to give a copy to our parish nurses, and so we're hoping it's still here.
Those that were turned in are still in a file. One of the things we're gonna do is we're gonna create a digital file of this. And we're also, at the end of the form, the last pages are, not surprisingly, planning my funeral. And this document we're going to make a digital form of, so that we can put it on the website. Anytime you're wanting to go fill it out, that would then get sent to the church, and regardless of who is pastor, regardless if there's a parish nurse or not, it's not only a copied paper, because that, I just think that having another place to store files and another place where we can go, that's not just in a manila folder, makes me feel a lot better, and I think would make those who have done the work feel better too. So that is coming.
And then once, so then can you keep going back in and changing things if you want to?
I think what you would probably do is be like, Judy Donnell updated. And then we would just compare it to the original, because I don't think there would be a way for, it's like filling a form out and then submitting, right?
Okay, there's
So,
a date.
yes, and there's a date, so we would be able to see when it's been updated, yeah. Any other questions that anyone wants to ask kind of right at the beginning?
So everyone should have one of these.
Yes,
then,
everyone,
right?
this will be helpful.
Anybody that
This is,
doesn't have a,
yes, this is a resource obviously for you, but if there's someone else in your life, I mean, talk about getting the conversation started. Sometimes it's helpful to be like, so I picked this up at church. You know, I mean, sometimes that's the hardest part is, I mean, one is, you know, confronting our own mortality and deciding what we want, but having the conversation with a loved one where the premise is, I know you're gonna die.
right.
That's really hard.
Yeah, I do want to say something, and that is, sometimes you, as the grown-up, will have to also force this mortality, open up the mortality to your children. And if I had to say there's one thing that the elder generation has not done well in preparing my generation, was to face mortality.
Yeah.
Will you say more about that,
Yes.
please?
For the generations, I think, just preceding mine, we are so caught up in medicine and so caught up in this new era of longevity that that we as younger children may not have seen many funerals, or we may not have seen as much death around us that used to just be a part of the house.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, literally part of the house. If I talk to my grandmother, you know, something like that, people encounter death all the time, but because of hospitals, because of funeral homes, because of care centers, unless you're a pastor and go into those spaces, or other professions where you go into those spaces regularly, death has been hidden. And so I have worked actively with my daughters to help them think about this process not as something that's wrong or horrible. It's a part of our journey. And that's been a really important conversation. And so while this has been great, and for me to talk to my parents about it, this will also be something that I will, and already have been, started talking with my daughters. And if you think that parents are hard, kids can be really hard.
What's it been like?
It's been, because my mom had dementia, that puts my risk of dementia up higher. And so I have little things that I want. I have a little baby doll that I had when I was a little girl, and I've put it away, and I said, so I was telling my daughter, when you're clearing things out, don't take away this doll. I want this doll to be with me, because as my memory goes, I want this will be comforting to me. My daughter goes, I don't want to know that. I need you to know. And so for our children, you know, I'm saying young adults, you don't have to put this upon a teenager, but for our young adults, helping them walk and know what you want as you age, or perhaps lose, you know, faculty in your mind, to let the people around you know what you want and what you hope for and what you don't want, is really a good conversation and an important one.
All right, so do you want to dive into this together? Just take a look at what's in here. Okay, so I'll just kind of walk you through. We're not going to read all of this together. Can you hear me okay when I talk without the mic?
Yeah.
You can? Okay. But at the top, I did think it was important to say that a faithful Christian funeral, at least as we would talk about it as Lutherans, and I think most Lutheran clergy would talk about it, is to bear witness to two things. To bear witness to the reality and pain of death, and to bear witness to the reality and hope of resurrection. And I think both are really needed, and it's part of what sets a Christian funeral apart from other services. That there is a promise proclaimed as we stare down the reality that none of us want. That God has not abandoned us, and that indeed there is life for the living and life for the one who has died on the other side.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
So I mentioned that my mother had dementia, and that meant that the last 2 years of her life, things were really rough in my family. And I'll just share a few details to sort of let you know the rough road. Is that she thought one of my brothers was poisoning her on a regular basis. And she thought that music on the radio had hidden messages. And fought with my dad regularly that he didn't love her anymore. So when you talk about the reality and the promise, there is a part, and I preached my mother's funeral. I normally would not do that, but my mother asked me to because she'd never really been around female preachers. And I was an inspiration to her. I mean, it's very mixed up, but we wrote it together at one point. And I wanted to name that the last years had been really difficult, but that wasn't what defined her. And that for everyone present, there was another promise that went way back and claimed her even when things were so hard in the space. So if there's a proclamation you want, this is a great time to do it.
So then listed underneath are the components of a typical liturgy. Of course, all of this is flexible, all of this can be adapted. But oftentimes we start a funeral by remembering baptism. And the words I usually say are, we remember at the beginning the waters that claimed this life upon the first breath, and the waters that claim this life upon the last. Like all of this is lived in Christ. And one of the things that an option at Grace, we have what's called a pall, and that's typically like a white or gold fabric that can be laid upon the casket, or a smaller one that can be laid upon an urn. And so literally covering the body is this promise. It's really quite beautiful, I think. Again, you decide. But really a symbolic and beautiful way to say, the promise isn't just spoken, it's actually embodied and covering this life that we are remembering. Oftentimes the service will include eulogies or remembrances from family and friends. A word to say about that, one thing you could say in your funeral is, I don't want that at all. Or, if someone shares one or two people, and if you want to name those, great, but if you want to limit it, I would recommend that. The two things we try to avoid in this part of the service is either stories that go on for 40, 50 minutes. Because, not that there's not more to say, there's always more to say. But it loses its sort of meaning and potency when people start to, eyelids start to get heavy, and you don't want that when you're remembering a life. We also suggest kind of resisting the beatification of a loved one. None of us become perfect when we die. So I think the more honest the stories can be, both about what made this person just so stinking unique and what made them so beloved and so worth loving, is like kind of what we would hope for. We recommend if there are stories shared that 1 or 2 people share, and that it is about 10 minutes or so. Just so that the uniqueness of the person can be celebrated right at the beginning, and then we move into the promise that this story is held in a much larger story, and then we move to scripture.
Okay, Thursday's funeral, one of the eulogy speakers was her childhood friend from 5 years old. And I think Bev was, over 75? Anyhow, she had it written down in a script, the highlights of their life together, the things that could be retold. And it was generally a joyous reflection of what her life had been and how she grew to be and what she did and all this other kind of stuff. That was kind of neat. And then there's Uncle Dickie's funeral, where Uncle Dickie, who used to like to drink a lot, his oldest son got up at the pulpit with he had a Manhattan in his hand. And every time he made a good point about his dad, scold Uncle Dickie. He finished the drink, but it was a great eulogy for Uncle Dickie.
I've never had that before, but
Hey, listen,
first time for
my request is, okay, Susan, I'd like to have communion at my service, but can we have it, the bread be bagel and the wine be a little bottle of Moby Dick for everybody? Let's have a good time.
actually write that into your plans.
You're being prepared, Pastor.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah.
Then, of course, scripture readings. Also, sometimes non-scripture readings. If there's a poem that you love, or a reflection from another writer, those are often included as well. Okay, turning to the back. Music. Music is a really wonderful part of a funeral service. There's a certain kind of just like joy and strength that I think is found like when people sing together a hymn that their loved one chose. Like it's just this like unifying of voices, celebrating and singing words that were important to the loved one. So typically it's hymns, but also we've had services where we play a song over the speakers, or a soloist can, vocal or instrumental. Those are options as well. And I wrote here, our accompanist appreciates knowing if there is a preference for organ or piano. Sometimes there is a strong preference. Yeah, and that's great. And Cheryl or whoever is playing just wants to honor that. A sermon, and yes?
I have a little addendum to the music one. As somebody who's played for quite a few funerals and weddings and things in the past, if you have a beloved family member and you have an idea in mind of a vocal solo, please don't just ask whoever, Cousin Margaret, will you sing this song at the funeral? Because Cousin Margaret may not be able to carry a tune in a bushel basket. And it'll be up to the accompanist at their little rehearsal time to start working on ear training with Cousin Margaret. And it takes a while. So that Cousin Margaret doesn't, get embarrassed when she's singing for the funeral. So if you want to include Cousin Margaret, and you're not sure if she sings or not, a reading would be a wonderful way to do
Yes. And also, even it's just a good opportunity to say family members have different feelings about being involved. And I think that's another part where holding what a loved one has planned with what a family member may want to actually do is something to just hold with love. If you're part of a congregation, there may be musicians that can step in and support the service in a way that would be really hard for a grandkid to do, right? Singing, I think, is, some family members love to sing and do so with just, it's kind of healing for them. Others are like, no way can I do that. And to put that pressure on someone when they could just be receiving that gift, crying when they need to. I think it's just something to consider, right? And that happened in my grandma's funeral. Like there were a couple places where she really wanted so-and-so to speak, and that person didn't want to, so they spoke at the memory night before, and then we just gave it to someone else. And if grandma would want us to honor if someone she chose doesn't feel like they can, right? So I just say that to say it often is a dynamic.
One person crying while they're singing is awkward.
Oh,
Everybody crying while they're singing is communally good.
It is one of the hardest things when you're crying and singing. Oh, it's terrible. A word about that though. Sometimes when family members are wondering about sharing stories, a lot of times I'll hear, "Oh, but I don't know if I can get through it." And almost always my response is, "Of course." Like to pretend that you don't have emotion in this space is not real. If the tears come as you're reading, here are some options. I'm happy to have a copy of what you're reading, and if it gets to be too hard, I'd be happy to step in and continue to be your voice. It's still your words. Or bring a sibling up next to you, and if you need to kind of like partner, or cry. And we'll wait. And you know what? It's going to give everyone else permission to feel. So I just really like to take the pressure off. And sometimes we think we need to perform and we need to pretend we don't feel what we feel so that we can do something. I mean, if in certain circumstances, if the death has been very tragic, I mean, I also am like, you don't have to, right? Other people can read your words for you, so you don't have that kind of expectation. We also had a funeral this year where the daughter really wanted to speak, but the death was very sudden and very hard. And so she recorded her message in the sanctuary, and then we played it at the funeral. So she could sit in the pew and sob, but her words and memories could still be heard. So these are like, I think, options that humanize it, they're real, and they still allow what you're hoping for to happen. It may just not happen in the way that we sometimes think we need to hold ourselves to. Does that make sense? So sermon. If you have things you would like to be shared in the sermon, you can, of course, write that out. Oftentimes I get my material the most from the meeting that I have with the family beforehand. And I never start those meetings with like, okay, what's the prelude? I start out with like, just tell me who your loved one was. What are the stories that you find yourself telling first? What are the adjectives that come to your mind when you think about this person? And that always gives enough to sort of know that I can find ways to weave together scripture and this particular person's life. Holy Communion is optional. Some people find that I think all of us who worship and practice the liturgy do find Holy Communion to be really meaningful. Communion can be shared around the deathbed. That's often a very powerful ritual, and so then when we do communion at the funeral, typically I'll say something like, the saints are around this table too. So this meal really does connect us to those right here and those who have gone before. It's this big circle of love. I would say that the thing that might give people pause is whether or not the communion ritual will feel like it brings the community gathered together. Sometimes families have people that are in really different walks of life, theologically and spiritually. And even though, I always say you will hear these words spoken, that it doesn't matter, you are welcome. Like that, we will make that abundantly clear. But if people feel like, but my granddaughter is Buddhist and my son-in-law, is mad at the church and which is not uncommon. Sometimes having a ritual that carries for some people exclusion rather than inclusion, or I have to be Christian and believe the right thing in order to come, or I'm only forgiven if, if there's some baggage sometimes attached to this, then people will feel like communion is going to splinter the community that's gathered rather than make us one community, right? People are welcome to come forward for a blessing. Like we make the welcome abundantly clear, but also respect if for this particular gathering, that may not be the thing that people include. And then the prayer and commendation at the end. Any questions about kind of those general pieces of the service? Yeah?
Getting back to music,
Yeah.
can you, and you can play a song, but can you play a video, like a YouTube video? There's a lot of wonderful music. And what comes to mind
That can-
is Andre Rue, Nearer My God to but you'd have to have a screen up there.
Yes, that can be done. Mhm. We've also had a couple services that have had like a slideshow of photos during with music behind. Sometimes that will follow the sermon. So definitely can be done. Where it gets a little tricky is if we're live streaming the service. Sometimes copyright issues mean that we can't put on the internet a song that we don't have rights to. That's the complicated behind the scenes stuff of live streaming, but everyone in the space would be able to hear it and see it.
Okay, as we're gathering, we sit in there and the organ is just playing. I got a list of songs, but I gotta tell you why I chose these songs. Is that allowable in the top half of the program?
Absolutely.
Because this is my Norwegian song, this is my Finnish song,
Yep.
this is because of.
Yep. Okay, the next page, and we're not gonna go through all of these, but these, as I sat down to put this packet together this past week, these were the questions that I thought might be common, might be ones that, you ask or a loved one asks you. Let me just say the questions. What is the difference between a funeral and memorial service? Really, that's a technicality. Like, it's not a big deal to know that, but sometimes people wonder. Does a burial have to take place the same day as the funeral or memorial service? Short answer is no, but it can be powerful for it too. Then there's questions about planning the service, getting it scheduled, live streaming. The question at the bottom is the hardest one. How do I estimate the number of people who will attend? It's this. But if you're having a luncheon, that's the first question that Linda will ask. So I put how we typically estimate. If you can get an idea, and this would be more the work of the family that's planning the service. As the one planning your funeral, I wouldn't recommend trying. Like, if you die at 67 or you die at 92, that really affects who can come to your service. And that's not about how loved you are, it's just passage of time. And most of your friends are probably not able to come. So for the family that's trying to decide how many sandwiches to have, we typically say the better, the more the control you may kind of have is in counting the number of family members who are planning to attend. Typically, text can be sent out, are you coming, or, and then doubling that. And then if there's not enough sandwiches, the luncheon team knows what to do during the service. And if there are way too many, we send the bounty out.
That's why they were funeral dishes.
Um,
My money's for months.
A couple,
Do you have accommodations?
I have a note at the deathbed, you mean? Or just at the site? Oh, at the burial site, yes.
Okay, sorry, a little up between pastor talk up here. So especially as people live longer and longer, sometimes I received a request not to do a funeral. Partially because family is scattered or there aren't many friends left. And so there may just be a service at the actual gravesite. Just if that's your wish, at least for me, I would still want to know what scripture is important. Some of those other pieces, there won't be music in the same way, maybe guitar, but music won't be there the same way, there won't be the fullness of a funeral. But if that's what you want, I still, and I'm sure Pastor Sarah would want to know, what your wishes might be about, scripture texts or what you would want said.
Yeah, good, great. The question on the top of the second page for this, are there other burial options? I'm going to make a plug right here for the speaker that we have coming on April 7th. It's a Monday evening. Ben Stewart is coming, and Ben was Pastor Reed and my worship professor at seminary in Chicago. And his sort of niche, the thing that he speaks about, writes about, is more sustainable practices around Christian burial. Green funerals would be the other way to say that. And so he's done a lot of research on what does that look like, how do I find resources for that. So I just commend that to you because he knows a lot more about that than any of us do, and I think at the very least it's thought-provoking to just think about other options that may not surface if you're working with a traditional funeral home. No judgment either way, it's just kind of good to learn about other options.
The bulletin mentioned it, but I don't know if it said where it'll be. Here?
Right here, yes. Monday, April 7th. Do I have that date right? Yeah. 6. The last two questions here, I just want to highlight, should we have kids at the funeral? And let me just read what I wrote in response. As with all things, we leave this to the discernment of the parents and guardians of each child, but generally we would encourage children to be present for a funeral. Children, just like adults, deserve a space to grieve, and a funeral is an important time for them to see how love shows up when death happens. Children will likely have questions, some of them very hard to answer, but the general guideline is to use plain language, to name it as death, rather than euphemisms like falling asleep or, grandma's just sleeping for a bit. To explain that death happens when a body stops working, to normalize sadness and discomfort, and to show our kids through it all that we have God with us and we have each other. The funeral I was talking about earlier about the daughter who spoke at the service, she had very young kids, and asked me when her mom was dying, should I bring my kids to the hospital? Again, leave it to you, but think about the conversations you'll be having with them if you don't let them see grandma. Why was I kept from that? What was happening that you wouldn't let me see? I mean, it's just a different, there's another loss attached to the loss if they were left out. And kids, there's a whole lot they don't understand, but they do know what it feels like to be left out. And same for the funeral. In some ways it can make death even scarier if it's so bad that you don't let me come. It's not to say it's going to be easy, but we can model what we do when it's not easy, when it's not fair, when there aren't answers. Yes. And so we come together and we cry and we love and we sing and we hold each other. That's what we do. That's what love does, right? So I would encourage children to be as involved in the rituals around a dying person and in the funeral. Of course, there are exceptions, but that would be my general guideline. And then we might as well talk about the last one, because that's why we're here. When I plan my funeral ahead of time, I won't be around to know any different.
Oh, don't count on that.
Or maybe you will be, and we'll deal with God on that one. Amidst all the other decisions that family members have to make at this time, it is a gift to receive a service that's already been put together by their loved one. Planning one's funeral is also a way to share your faith with loved ones. The scriptures and hymns will convey who you knew God to be in your life. So I think the exercise is profoundly meaningful as the person putting the plan into place, and profoundly meaningful and freeing for loved ones who receive it. So that's why I would say it's worth doing, and maybe more times than one. The next part of the packet has, I had someone who hasn't been to church in a very long time, but grew up going here, and they raised their kids here, and her husband died maybe about a month ago. And she walked into the room, the death was very sudden. She walked into the room and she just threw her body on the table in tears. And she's like, I can't do this. And it was one of those moments where I was like, thank God we have the church. So many people go through this, and who comes alongside them to say you don't have to do this? I'm here, your kids are here at this table, and together with texts that have been read for thousands of years, we're gonna help you do this impossible thing. Oftentimes the impossible thing, if there's not been a funeral planned, when I say the question, what scriptures would you like read? People are like, you know, it's a daunting book, that Bible. And so here, friends, are suggestions. And I mean, any text is good if it means something to you. I mean, I think that sometimes we specifically choose texts about death and the promise that undergirds the reality of death. But I've also had lots of people, like when my grandma died, we did the feeding of the 5,000 because my grandma, like her table was central to her life. And even when she wasn't expecting people at her door, when the milkman arrived and the kid from, who was a hired hand for the summer was there, she was like, let's eat, and somehow whipped up a meal with what she had. So that's the text we worked with for her funeral. Someone else who died this past year was a special education teacher. So let the little children come to me was the text we used. So these texts are going to be more geared toward death and the promise of God in the time of death. But I would just encourage you, if there are other texts that you feel like lift up something you value in this life that's not listed here, awesome. Like go with it. But if it's helpful to have a list to start from, here you go, we got you. So there's some Old Testament, Psalms, New Testament, Gospel, and then some hymns along with the hymn numbers. Again, a place to start, can get your mind kind of going, but there are just some references there if that's helpful for you in planning. On the back of the hymns is preparing for my funeral. This is more like preparing for the reality that I will one day die. Okay, so you'll notice number 5 says plan the service. So planning your service is one of the things. But someone last week after the forum on grief said, oh, it'd be so nice to have like a checklist of some things to just think about getting taken care of. So here's the checklist. Discuss your wishes. Talk openly with family and friends about your preferences when it comes to embalming or cremation, burial, funeral service, etc. Choose a funeral home and cemetery. Decide on burial or cremation. You can go and select products, so a casket or an urn based on your preferences. Plan the service, we'll talk about that in a second. Organize your documents. Write an obituary. Want to say something about that, Dawn?
I do.
Yeah.
And this comes actually from my coaching background. And we encourage people to write obituaries often. Whether it's, what have I already done? It's like if you're climbing up a mountain path, we often concentrate on how far it is to the top, but we don't very often look behind us and see how far we've come. And so writing obituary is a beautiful way to say, look at the life that I have lived. It was good, it was worthy, it was present moment. I was, on this. And then some of it might be aspirational, meaning you might have things that you still want to be able to say that you can't say yet. And that might be God's invitation to you to do some things differently as you move forward. So obituary, again, I said, for my mom, I knew a lot of things that she had done up through about when I was 30. But there were a lot of things that were meaningful and deep in her life that I didn't know about nearly in the same way, that if she hadn't written her obituary, her life probably would have kind of stopped at 30 if I had to write it.
Yeah, it's a really good point.
You know your life best. You know what's most important. You know what you want to say about the loved ones in your life. So say it.
I'm thinking too about, some of you were in the forum last weekend, but, oh my gosh, what's his name? Brandon? Brandon? Oh my gosh, he's a good friend of mine.
Yeah.
Brandon?
Brandon.
Okay.
Yeah, that guy.
I better plan my funeral.
Sugar beets.
But he was talking about a blessing that he often does for the bodies that are nearing death, gathers the families around and blesses the body. So what he shared with us is to bless first the head, which houses the mind. So what did this person help you think about? What wisdom did they pass on to you? The nose was, what smells did they especially like? Or what will you smell that will then help you remember them? Smell is a very potent connection to experiences we've had before. The ears, what did they love to listen to? What was their favorite song? How did they tell you they loved you? What did you hear when they spoke? The mouth, what were their favorite tastes, favorite foods? Or what was a meal you shared with them that you'll remember? And then the feet, what did they stand for? And what I appreciated about what Brandon said is that the way that doing that blessing really affected how he thought of himself as a dad right now. Like, oh man, someday, hopefully, life will go in such a way that my kids will gather around me. And what will they say? What I'm doing now is shaping what they will say. And I think an obituary exercise is similar, right? Like a time to sort of hold up the mirror to your life and narrate it. What has been the greatest gifts? Where have I felt closest to God? What's brought me joy? It's just really an opportunity of reflection. Consider a visitation or reception, and consider prepayment. Like Dawn said,
Please consider prepayment. I know that's a horrible thing to say, but if it's within your means, and you feel stable in your space of life, like you're not moving all around the country where it's going to become an issue, it really is. Our generations coming after us are already carrying a lot of financial burden for a lot of things. And this is one piece, especially if they don't know when it's coming or where it's coming, that can be a great relief to them.
okay, so the last part of the packet is your worksheet, your homework, planning my funeral or memorial service. So this is really just giving you space to fill in what we've already talked about in terms of what the service could entail. A couple things just to note. Sometimes people's legal name is different than the name they were called their whole life. And it can feel kind of weird if like a Candy is suddenly referred to in the service as Candace, and people are like, what? So if you have a name you've gone by and one that you prefer, we hang a funeral banner that's beautiful. I have called you by name. Diana Austin typically changes the name, and always she's like, what is it? Jennifer, Steve, Steven. What does the family know this person by? Or if you know yourself by, you can put that there. Notify these people at the time of my death. Candy and I just had the experience a couple weeks ago. Candy, with her big heart for people around us, noticed that she hadn't heard from Ingrid for a while. And so Candy called and texted and then eventually called the police and said, would you please go check on Ingrid? And the police found that she had died and probably had been dead for a while. And then we began this long process of trying to figure out who to call. Ingrid's husband died several years ago, and she has no children. And so we were looking at Facebook posts. We were sending emails to her writing group. We just didn't know who to call. Hence, in addition to the funeral planning form, who can we call? It may be that someone knows right away, and that's obvious. It may not be. And so if your church happens to be called, we can step in and help. And obviously this helps, that's an unusual situation, but this helps in knowing who should we be planning the service with? Who are the people that you would like us to be in touch with? Preferred funeral home. That was another thing Brandon shared last weekend, that if you choose a funeral home and pay for it, and then for some reason the family decides they'd like to go with another one, that gets transferred to the new funeral home chosen. I didn't know that before last week, so just.
They all live in that?
What?
Are they all?
I don't know.
Okay.
Well, I think he said it was a law in the state of Minnesota.
I think so.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So they better be, otherwise.
I can contribute to that a little bit.
Oh, great.
I did stop at a couple funeral homes here in Apple Valley, and the one told me that because costs have increased so much, that perhaps prepaying is not something that they prefer anymore. He suggested having a separate account
Insurance policy.
with your, like, if you've got kids, having a separate account that they can write checks from to pay for your funeral. But if you set aside money, at least.
It may not, okay.
Yeah.
And what if they're out of business?
Don't they have to at least legally tell you this and allow you to transfer to another home?
Just saying.
Oh.
Great questions.
Yeah.
Well, and when my father-in-law died, my mother-in-law had me look at something because they were giving her some hassle. And, we got it straightened out, so she didn't have to pay extra, but there was a little hassle.
I worked with somebody once that, they were just going through their paperwork before they did pass away, checking with the funeral home, and they said, we don't show that you paid. We had to go through 2 boxes of papers to find her receipt from the funeral home that she did pay.
Oh dear.
What a hassle it was.
But what a blessing that you could help with that.
Well, you know, but it just, the anger,
Yeah, sure.
that comes up in you,
Yes.
you know, and it wasn't me, it was just a friend, and I just thought, oh my gosh, can't you keep better records? You know, because her husband had died about 15 years prior,
Oh,
and they paid for her service at that time as well.
Sure.
And maybe it's because it had gone up,
Right.
you know?
Okay, you say you put the pall over the casket or the urn. Well, my dad came back in a Spam can. Grandma came back in a corrugated plastic box, and Ada was gift wrapped. She was cremated, and her daughter-in-law, and she's gonna be in the church cemetery, put her in a nice little box with a ribbon. You know, so please don't say that we're not being nice if you Spam can. Anyhow, and another thing is, me too, you know, cheap as possible, save the money. Anyhow, another one was, I keep going through the obituaries because I've been in a heck of a lot of groups, okay? Sure is nice to know if a classmate of mine died. Some of you may have been in a class of 4 or 5, 40 or 50 people. I was in a class of 650. You know, and tell me, you know, or the age. Did I know you, or did you not go to my high school? Okay, or did you not go to my college? Or were you in Sons of Norway? Were you in Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts? You know, mention, if you can, some of the organizations you were in, because when they put in that picture of you as an old and wrinkled thingy, you don't look the same as when you were, you know, the president of the lodge 40, 50 years ago.
Sometimes
So, you
that's
know,
the
give them a hint on who you are or
I've
were.
seen that a lot.
Yeah, a whole lot of, or the 1941. That was before, you know, give us a
Okay,
hint
so
of
we're
who you were.
we're just gonna keep moving so we can get through this, and then, day
I
of the
just
funeral.
about, so thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Day of the funeral and memorial service, these would be the questions to think about and to respond to. I did put next to the readings and the hymns. Why did you choose that? Like if there is a reason, if there's a reason it speaks to you, if it connects to something you value in your life, I've often included that in the sermon, that so-and-so included this and says this about it. And it really is impactful to hear why those were chosen. Holy Communion, and then anything else that you want to share about your hopes for this service. And then after the service, that's about burial and about a luncheon or reception. When you have completed this, please share a copy with your family and with your church. And remember, it is okay to change or update these plans. And then the last page just talks about like logistics and fees for funerals.
make a comment to make sure that you're financially, the person, with my father, he had a power of attorney, but that ended when he died, so nobody could get at his money, nor the pay for it. So I had to put it on charge card and pay for it all. And then get reimbursed once the will was read and all the financial stuff was done. So, there's something called a transfer on death that you should have.
Helpful.
Yeah,
Very
please.
helpful.
Another quick thing too, I ran into about my mom died, I was power of attorney, but I wasn't an owner on the checking account or on the savings account. We didn't have the transfer on death, and as soon as the person dies, your power of attorney is done.
Right.
And when it comes to financial deals,
Really
checking
helpful.
accounts and all of that, so we would have known that, we had to go through probate, which was very easy, but still, you can avoid that.
Right,
A lot of time.
it does.
To get access.
Tommy and his mother and his sister were on the same checking account to pay for grandma.
Yeah, yeah.
So it was good for several years.
You gotta be careful with that.
Any other questions
Your
that
bank.
you want to ask?
Thank you, Pastor Sarah.
Thank you.
Oh.